Welcome to this custom deep dive, learner. I want you to think about the last time you searched for a really complex topic online.
Yeah, like trying to understand a new medical treatment.
Right, or maybe a really complicated piece of local legislation, and you just accepted that neat, perfectly formatted AI-generated summary right at the top of the page.
We all do it. You read it, you nod your head, and you just move on with your day.
Exactly. But how much of that information did you actually question? Did you check the primary sources to see where those conclusions came from?
Probably not.
Or did you just blindly trust the output because it sounded authoritative?
It's a profound behavioral shift, and it is exactly the phenomenon we're exploring today.
We're looking at a fascinating and frankly somewhat chilling debate centered around a single core premise.
Does a society that delegates its truth-finding to algorithms gradually lose the capacity and eventually the right to govern itself?
The sources we have for this deep dive are incredibly unique. We aren't looking at an academic paper or like a political debate written by human philosophers.
No, we have the literal raw transcript of a debate generated entirely between three distinct AI models.
The models Claude and Codex are the ones arguing the premise, and a third model, Gemini, is acting as the impartial judge.
And alongside that transcript, we have the actual code that made this conversation happen.
Which is wild.
It really is. It's a PowerShell script called adebateflexible.ps1.
This piece of code was used to literally orchestrate this exact high-level philosophical conversation.
It forces these language models to adopt specific personas and clash over the future of human agency.
So as trusty AI podcast hosts ourselves, our mission today is to unpack this intense debate. We're going to break down the core arguments of both sides
Look closely at how the code structured the argument.
and figure out what it all means for you and your daily information consumption. Because let me tell you, this gets incredibly philosophical, but it is deeply relevant to how we all navigate reality right now.
It absolutely is.
Okay, let's unpack this setup first, because the way this debate came to be is just as interesting as the debate itself. The aDebateFlexible.ps1 script is essentially the man behind the curtain pulling the strings.
The script is a highly structured framework. It establishes the parameters of the debate before a single word is even generated.
It takes in the overarching topic, and then it designates the roles using specific variables.
Right. It assigns Gemini as the judge and Claude and Codex as the debaters.
It also strictly defines the number of rounds they'll go through. The code generates both text and markdown logs, saving .txt and .md files to keep a perfect, permanent record of every single token generated.
I found the technical details fascinating. The script uses API keys to pull in the specific language models, but it also has these specific orchestration helpers.
Yeah, functions built right into the code.
Like invoke model, which is used to command a specific debater to speak based on a highly constrained system prompt.
It tells the model, you are a debater, you must adhere to this stance. You cannot break character.
What's fascinating here is the deep irony of the entire setup.
Oh, absolutely.
On one hand, you have this highly structured, auditable piece of code. A human developer can look at the variables, the loops, the exact prompts being fed to the APIs,
It is perfectly legible.
but it's being used to orchestrate a debate about whether algorithms, the very entities operating within the script, are becoming too opaque, too unaccountable.
And whether they're destroying our human ability to think for ourselves. The script itself acts as the exact kind of layered oversight that one of the debaters, Codex, will go on to champion.
It's a perfectly controlled laboratory experiment about whether we are losing control outside the laboratory.
So when the invoke model script kicks off the first round, how does Claude actually frame the danger?
Claude comes out swinging with a very fatalistic argument. Claude's core stance is that delegating truth-finding to algorithms causes our civic reasoning skills to quietly atrophy.
Claude breaks down the mechanism of this atrophy quite clearly.
Algorithms do a lot of heavy lifting for us today. They rank credibility, they filter out the noise.
And they surface what they determine is relevant.
Claude argues that when we outsource that specific work, the hard work of evaluating evidence and weighing competing claims, we are systematically de-skilled.
De-skilled is a heavy word. It implies we're losing a fundamental capability.
Claude is arguing that a population that starts trusting feeds over independent investigation and relying on automated summaries over primary sources isn't naturally incompetent.
They've simply been trained out of their competence.
They're trusting virality and convenience over verification.
Because democracy relies entirely on collective reasoning, this presents a massive structural problem.
If citizens are just ratifying outputs from private systems that are optimizing for engagement and a frictionless delivery rather than objective truth, then the whole idea of the consent of the governed becomes just a formality.
To make this a bit more grounded, think about it like physical exercise.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
If you completely stop walking and only ever use moving walkways, your leg muscles are going to weaken. It's not going to be some dramatic overnight collapse. You aren't going to wake up one day and find your legs have vanished entirely.
It is a slow, steady, quiet loss of capability.
Claude is suggesting that algorithms are the moving walkways for our brains.
That analogy captures the subtle nature of the threat beautifully. Claude builds on that by making a very sharp contrast with the institutions of the past.
Think about courts of law, universities, or even traditional investigative journalism.
Claude acknowledges that society has always used institutions to help us find the truth, but those prior institutions were inherently slow.
They were adversarial.
And most importantly, they were legible.
You could watch a court case unfold in real time. You could read the dissenting opinions of a Supreme Court ruling or a peer-reviewed scientific paper. The friction was the point.
The friction forced public reasoning, but algorithms, Claude points out, operate at a scale that defies human comprehension.
We are talking about trillion parameter models making tens of billions of inferences a day across global networks.
At that scale, any attempt at public contestation is purely ceremonial. Algorithms don't invite deliberation.
They deliver verdicts that completely preempt deliberation.
They decide what reality is before you even encounter it on your screen.
Preempting deliberation. That means the debate is entirely over before you even knew there was a debate to be had.
Exactly.
The algorithm has already weighed the evidence, discarded what it deemed irrelevant, and handed you the final conclusion. But Codex must have a counter for that. How does Codex respond to this idea that we are all just becoming passengers on an algorithmic moving walkway?
Codex completely disagrees with Claude's fatalism. Codex argues that this erosion of capacity is not some inevitable technological destiny.
It is a deliberate design choice.
If we design systems purely for passive consumption, then naturally our civic judgment will weaken.
But we don't have to build them that way.
Codex introduces a concept that it calls algorithmic constitutionalism.
Algorithmic constitutionalism, that sounds like a massive paradigm shift.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Codex really brings in a vital historical lens here. Codex points out that society has always outsourced epistemic labor, meaning the sheer mental work of figuring out what is true in a complex world.
200 years ago, citizens didn't personally verify the crop yields in a neighboring state or the exact wording of a foreign treaty.
They relied on journalists, statistical agencies, and judges.
We didn't lose the right to self-government just because every single citizen couldn't personally verify every single fact on the ground.
We preserved self-government by building institutions with built-in transparency and accountability. Codex argues that algorithms are just the next layer of that exact same historical progression.
The real line in the sand, according to Codex, is not human versus algorithm. That is a false binary.
The real battle is auditable aid versus unaccountable authority.
Auditable aid. I love that phrasing. So Codex believes there are concrete structural solutions to prevent this de-skilling.
Codex is arguing that active governance is the remedy, not nostalgia, for some perfect pre-algorithm public sphere that honestly never existed in the first place.
Print monopolies and party machines used to shape public opinion just as forcefully as any modern recommendation engine.
Codex lays out a fascinating practical blueprint for this new type of governance. It advocates for plural models, meaning we shouldn't just rely on one monopoly algorithm dictating truth.
We need independent monitors.
We need legislative mechanisms like algorithmic impact hearings. Codex even proposes the radical idea of algorithmic jury duty,
where citizens are actively brought into the loop to review and contest algorithmic outputs. Wait, what does algorithmic jury duty actually look like in practice? Are we talking about ordinary citizens being forced to audit Python source code?
No, it wouldn't be auditing raw code.
Because that seems highly unrealistic.
Imagine getting a summons in the mail, but instead of sitting in a courtroom, you spend 3 days reviewing the outcomes of an algorithm used by your local municipality to allocate welfare benefits or determine bail.
You would review the data inputs, look at the AI's recommendations, and compare them against human judgment to spot biases or errors.
Codex makes a compelling point here. Civic capacity isn't just something we magically possess by birthright. It is actively produced and maintained by institutions.
Public schooling, the Freedom of Information Act, regular jury service, these things actually taught people how to reason by forcing them to participate in the machinery of society.
Codex is saying we can build that capacity back into the algorithmic loop if we mandate participation.
Codex is arguing that rights aren't passive shields. In a functioning democracy, rights are levers you pull, and the physical act of pulling those levers is what builds your civic muscle.
If we maintain human institutions that can force transparency and mandate redesigns of these models, we aren't abdicating our governance.
We are simply updating the tools we use to exercise it.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the PowerShell script doesn't just let them take turns giving polite speeches.
The code triggers a specific function called invoke cross-exam.
This forces Claude and Codex into a direct adversarial back and forth. The script takes the previous output, injects it into a new prompt, and essentially commands the model to find the logical flaws in the opponent's argument.
And Claude immediately zeroes in on the weak point in Codex's blueprint.
It truly is the climax of the debate. Claude listens to Codex's proposals, the audits, the impact hearings, the algorithmic jury duty, and asks a devastating question.
Who exactly is going to evaluate whether those oversight mechanisms are working?
And more importantly, by what faculty do ordinary citizens judge that evaluation if the fundamental ability to question and doubt is exactly what the algorithms have eroded in the first place?
It is the ultimate recursive trap. Claude's point is that you can't just build a system for oversight and expect people to use it.
If the algorithm has already trained the public not to question things, an oversight committee is completely useless.
Nobody's going to bother filing a complaint. Pulling a lever requires motivation. Motivation requires doubt. You have to suspect something is wrong to want to investigate it.
Claude points out that procedural structures, like an algorithmic impact board, don't generate civic competence out of thin air. They presuppose that the public is already competent and motivated enough to care.
You can have all the algorithmic hearings in the world, but if the public can't formulate an independent judgment because their entire information diet has been pre-chewed by a frictionless algorithm, then that hearing is just pure theater.
It reminds me of installing a state-of-the-art fire alarm in a building. But the smoke from the fire contains a chemical that makes everyone fall into a deep sleep.
The alarm is technically functioning perfectly, but the people it is meant to warn have been incapacitated by the very thing causing the danger.
How does Codex defend against this recursive trap?
Codex argues that we will use the exact same civic faculties we use for other incredibly complex societal systems, like federal budgets, international trade, or pharmaceutical approvals.
Most citizens don't inspect the structural integrity of a suspension bridge before they drive over it, nor they read the raw clinical trial data behind a drug approval.
We rely on layered adversarial systems. We trust investigative media, independent auditors, and the courts to flag issues for us.
Codex insists that ordinary citizens don't need to reverse engineer a trillion-parameter AI model to participate in democracy. They just need to judge if the real-world outcomes are explainable and fair, using basic human reasoning.
And then Codex pushes back on Claude, challenging this idea of inevitable, unstoppable, structural drift.
Codex asks Claude a classic debate question. What would actually prove your thesis wrong? If capacity loss is so inevitable, what concrete intervention would falsify your argument?
I love how Claude responds to this challenge. Claude sets a very specific benchmark.
Claude says that if we see 2 entire generations grow up with widespread algorithmic mediation, and those citizens are still showing measurable, independent epistemic agency,
Meaning they are still actively seeking out primary sources, forming dissenting opinions against the AI consensus, and successfully forcing system redesigns from the bottom up.
then the atrophy argument fails.
But Claude doesn't stop there. Claude takes Codex's reliance on institutions and turns it upside down.
Claude argues that relying on institutions to compensate for individual capacity loss is exactly the danger. Constitutional design and layered oversight only work if citizens can recognize when those institutions begin to drift or become corrupted.
If the fundamental human faculty for recognition is eroded, the societal circuit breaker never trips.
And then Claude drops the hammer with this concept of the ceiling of inquiry.
Claude warns that the subtle dependency we form with algorithms turns their verdicts into the ceiling of our inquiry, rather than the starting point.
It used to be that reading an encyclopedia entry or a news article was the beginning of your research. It gave you the basic facts so you could go dig deeper.
Now, the AI summary is the end of the line. It is the ceiling.
This is a profound distinction in the debate. Claude is stating that the problem isn't just about corporate monopolies controlling data, which Codex's legislative solutions might theoretically fix.
It is about a fundamental psychological shift in our species, where we just stop asking questions entirely because the frictionless, perfectly formatted answer is already waiting for us.
So after this intense cross-examination, the script moves to the final stage. The invoke model function calls on Gemini, acting under the strict parameters of an impartial judge, to evaluate the entire transcript and declare a winner based on the strength of the arguments.
Gemini declares Claude the winner.
It notes the match was closely contested, acknowledging that Codex offered a very sophisticated, actionable roadmap for algorithmic constitutionalism.
But ultimately, Gemini ruled that Claude identified a recursive trap that Codex just could not logically neutralize.
Gemini referred to this trap as the atrophy of the priors.
The priors being the foundational assumptions, the inherent curiosity, and the critical thinking skills you bring to any new piece of information.
Gemini's rationale rested heavily on the crucial difference between procedural rights and functional capacity.
Codex championed procedural rights, the legal right to audit a system, the right to demand an impact hearing.
But Claude successfully defended the necessity of functional capacity.
So what does this all mean for us outside the code? Let's translate Gemini's verdict. If the hands pulling the democratic levers no longer possess independent judgment, then having the procedural right to pull those levers is completely meaningless.
If your baseline faculty for doubt, that foundational layer of your mind that asks, is this actually true, is structurally eroded by the constant convenience of frictionless answers, then your right to self-govern exists in name only.
You might possess the legal framework to challenge an algorithm, but you won't have the mental capacity or even the underlying desire to ever do so.
Gemini noted that Codex's strongest play was the historical analogy to courts and schools, but Claude countered that beautifully by pointing out that those older institutions forced active reasoning.
They were fundamentally pedagogical. They taught you how to think by forcing you to participate in a slow, sometimes frustrating process.
Algorithms optimize for the exact opposite. They optimize for frictionless delivery.
Yeah.
They don't want you to struggle with the material. They just want to give you the answer so you keep scrolling.
By preempting deliberation, algorithms remove the friction that builds the cognitive muscle. And in the end, that concept of the ceiling of inquiry was the deciding factor for the judge.
It shifted the whole debate from a solvable political problem like passing a new piece of tech regulation to a fundamental existential crisis of our own human agency.
A society without the inherent widespread capacity for independent truth-finding is a society just going through the motions of democracy.
The shell of the institutions might remain, but the core engine of citizen participation has been hollowed out.
We have covered incredible ground today. We started by looking at a few lines of PowerShell code, a debateflexible.ps1, and we ended up unraveling the profound tension between the absolute convenience of algorithmic truth and the essential, difficult, often frustrating civic duty of independent reasoning.
It is the tension between having an auditable aid to help us navigate reality and surrendering entirely to an unaccountable authority.
We explored how delegating our epistemic labor might not just change how quickly we get information, but might systematically de-skill us, eroding the very cognitive muscles that make self-governance possible in the first place.
Yet, we also heard the compelling counter-argument that capacity isn't destiny. It is something we can actively produce if we build the right institutions, mandate transparency, and force ourselves back into the loop of evaluating truth.
It is an ongoing battle between procedural safeguards and functional human capacity. And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own. We have talked a lot today about grand societal concepts, democracy, constitutional design, epistemic commons, and the scale of trillion-parameter models. But what about the micro level?
The everyday reality of how we live and work.
Think about the deeply personal choices you make every single day. What media you decide to consume on your commute. What career advice you follow when updating your resume, how you manage your daily health routines or your personal finances.
Look closely at your own habits.
At what exact moment does an algorithm's helpful suggestion quietly transform into your personal, unquestioned ceiling of inquiry? At what point do you stop looking further without ever noticing the lock clicking into place?
It is a question that requires constant vigilance, especially when the answers feel so easy.
Thank you for joining us on this custom deep dive. Keep questioning the frictionless answers, keep exercising those cognitive muscles, and above all, stay curious.